Hackers are out there, waiting to strike anyone. And if you don't do something about it soon, you'll be in trouble. There is a year-over-year increase in cyber attacks, costing you time, money, and pull you away from running your business. Whether your environment is a hybrid, single cloud, or multi-cloud, you should elevate your security posture instead of putting out fires. Crayon Managed Security Posture is a comprehensive managed security service offering covering security posture and vulnerability management, as well as managed detection and response. Improve your security posture without additional cost, detect and remediate weaknesses, and respond to imminent threats with managed security posture. Contact Crayon to enhance your security and keep hackers away.
Hey everyone, we are absolutely thrilled to have you on board. I'm Linda, and I'm going to be the moderator of today. Grab a comfy seat, a cup of coffee, and let's dive in. No doubts, cloud is here to stay, and keep in mind, it's very crucial. Is your security keeping up? So let's unlock the gates to a cyber-secure future and take a look on today's topics. So here they are. We're going to cover three main topics. And let me introduce our main experts. And voila, Alex, our Technical Service Sales Director, and Pekka, Vice President of Cybersecurity Services. Welcome, guys. So I'm going to take over to our experts the floor. So floor is yours.
All right. Good morning, potentially good evening, good afternoon to everybody. Today we're going to be talking through trends and best practices in securing the cloud. And with that, we can move on in the presentation to the next slide. So a few words about Crayon and cybersecurity. At Crayon, cybersecurity and cybersecurity services are critical focus areas. We have a global cybersecurity organization with broad experience in cybersecurity operations, engineering, and architecture across industries like government, telecom, manufacturing, finance, software as a service, and so forth. We're delivering security services across several regions that have also been recognized with security status and specializations from Microsoft. And our specialists and experts are certified across the board in this domain. But let's move on to talking about the opposite side, the threat actors. Teenagers. Many of the individuals forming the modern threat actor groups deeply feared by organizations looking to protect their data and services have been revealed to be teenagers. Lapsus and scattered spider are just few examples of myriad names that they are using to hide behind. Now, don't be put off by the word teenager. Despite of their young age, these juvenile delinquents have been causing havoc across big, small, private, and public sector organizations alike. Data extortion and ransomware attacks for financial gain are common. Yet there are other forms of attacks as well, disrupting services, publicly defacing companies, and even threatening their employees just for giggles, are some of the many atrocities these threat actors have been found guilty of. So we're looking essentially a constellation of threat actors formed out of individuals loosely connected to each other that are aggressive and opportunistic, and they do have unpredictable motivations. Obviously, next to them, we also do have the more common organized crime groups, nation-state threat actors, and so forth. But if we've looked and paid attention to the recent prolific attacks, a lot of them have been executed by threat actors such as Lapsus and Scattered Spider that have these teenager individuals behind them. Now, if we then start talking about the methods, these so-called tactics, techniques, and procedures that they are employing in their cyber attacks, we find some interesting trends. The first thing is that many of these threat actors and individuals don't necessarily have to break into your organization. They simply try logging in first. A lot of these attacks are identity-based. They will be based upon things like stolen credentials. If these simple attacks with stolen credentials or purely brute forcing their access in does not work, we're typically looking at something like highly targeted social engineering and phishing attacks, and getting very, very scary good at these attacks in particular. They're often aimed at things like compromising your cloud administrator accounts and these cloud admin devices with things like session cookie theft or so forth. Now, in addition to these types of attacks for the initial access that all attackers do need, the modern threat actor seems to be very good at understanding knowing IT processes, business processes, things such as device management solutions, how email platforms work. Specifically, they are getting very, very good at understanding identity management solutions as well. So they do look to abuse organizations' built-in processes, technologies, essentially finding gaps in your basic security posture more often than using things such as zero-day vulnerabilities or established malware.
So also good afternoon or good morning from my side, depending on where you are in the world. Coming back to Pekka's comment of the, let's say, modern threat actors and how they're gaining access, I think it's good to also take a look at on how do we actually defend nowadays. And typically, an organization, let's say their main security mechanism, if you will, from security operations perspective, is something called a SOC, or Security Operations Center. And there you can see that typically what it means is that people are responding to alerts and potential successful attacks of an adversary. And while that is, of course, the last line of defense, you can see that with ongoing digitalization activities, actually, it becomes quite tedious for security operations centers to keep up. And there was a very interesting, as you can see on the screen, very interesting report made by Devo, where they have went through, I believe, 1,000 or over 1,000 security analysts asking different questions. And one of the questionnaire was about pain in the organizations to meet their daily requirements. And as you can see, over 60% responded more than average when it comes to pain in their jobs. And yeah, it's of course a pity, but also something that should have been expected. Because if you think about the current attack vector and threat landscape, it's expanding. Attackers are developing all the time. There's more and more innovations that are brought into IT on a very, very fast pace. But in addition to that, there's a complete infrastructure transformation going on, typically in terms of hybrid environments. So you have on-prem to defend, you have also the cloud to defend, and then you have end user services that might be on-prem in the cloud or hybrid. So obviously that is a very, let's say in a short time frame, the amount of complexity is pretty much exponential. And if you think about the defense mechanisms or the trends today to tackling these issues, oftentimes leaders are searching for answers in technology. And certainly there is definitely no shortage of security technologies in the world today. In fact, there's more and more startups, more and more even bigger organizations developing their own security solutions. However, unfortunately, it turns out that that is not an answer. For example, U.S. Cyber Safety Review Board, which is a organization under CISA. They're basically it's an organization based out of government officials, but as well as security engineering leaders, SecOps leaders from hyperscalers. So basically, a board that reviews major crimes or major incidents and tries to backtrace that what happened, why happened, and how to avoid these type of things. So they have pretty much stated that actually we need to go back to basics. Now that the threat landscape has changed or evolved, and obviously a lot of it has to do with our own innovation and digitalization efforts, we need to make sure that the basics are in place. And in fact, adding more technology to solve a problem is most likely not a fair or a reasonable option. So that leaves us to a conclusion that instead of putting out fires, we need to learn how to build let's say, an architecture, how to enforce processes and architecture, defense architecture, so that there would be less fires from the begin with. And let's say security posture management has been a growing trend for the past years, but it seems that with all the speed that is needed to innovate, sometimes going back to the basics is not something that companies have the luxury of doing or even have the skill set of performing, because obviously now you have many more technology platforms to maintain and secure and keep secure. Hence, obviously, managing a security posture is also, let's say, a task that requires true attention, but as well as efforts. So if I think about security posture and what does it actually then mean at the end of the day? So in our sense, there are three things that would make a good, let's say, security posture. First is to have something called baselines and guardrails. Basically, to have security controls in place, environment hardened, configured, so that we ensure that environment is secure. And we do have policies that either enforce certain usage of technology, or then a policy that can trigger for example, a response upon not meeting certain requirements on how an environment should be used, how we should behave in an environment. Then the second step is to actually detect not just the alerts that you see from security technologies, like, for example, Security Operations Center does, but also detect potential risky configurations or exclusions from security policies or overlapping policies that might trigger, let's say, weaknesses in your environment, because if you have a partial policy that is fulfilled, usually it means that both policies are fulfilled. So in that respect, instead of looking at alerts when milk has been spilled, so to speak, or when the fire is starting to burn, we should actually think about how to detect actions before that, so that we can react earlier, but also we would be able to make sure that potential damage is minimized. And a lot of it has to do with automation. So when it comes to obviously the last piece, it's not just, say, incident response, but if we are early in the, let's say, weakness cycle, so to speak, if we detect actions which might be, for example, new configurations or policy that are created that create weaknesses in our IT estate, we're able to automatically react to those before those get exploited by the adversary. And even in case some of them will get exploited by the adversary, if we have a proper security baselines and guardrails in place, even some part of the response can be automated.
So if we then kind of follow up on what Alex just walked you through, let's look at a couple of examples. We look at this from often neglected side of cloud security posture management. Very often that term only gets associated with platform services. So think of or infrastructure services. So think of that as your Azure or AWS as prime examples. But equally, cloud security posture management should be extended into your end user cloud services. So now we're talking about the end user and productivity services. If we think about a few threat scenarios that we spoke earlier, so we think about the threat actors that we mentioned at the beginning and their tactics, techniques, and procedures. I think the first thing attackers typically try to do is that initial access piece. So they spend a lot of effort and take a lot of time making sure that they gain access, some form of access into their target organization or organizations. So an example could be getting a hold of stolen credentials and then simply trying to log in with them. Organizations that might be protected with some rudimentary, I would say, hygiene level controls, such as multi-factor authentication. And Alex, one on the background operating the slides, I think you can reveal, yes, one more time. Thank you. There we are. Let's just pair these up right from the get-go. So, and make some sort of dialogue between the control and the threat. I think the first part is that either you get in with stolen credentials if rudimentary controls such as multi-factor authentication is missing from the organization, or it is not applied consistently. If that is in place, however, so let's take that as the first minimum level of security baseline for your identity. We take care that we have multi-factor authentication in place. And us at Crayon focusing very much on Microsoft end user cloud services. I'll talk in a terminology and language that might make you recognize that the examples are primarily from M365, Intune managed devices, or things like Entra ID governed identities. So now we get to two fundamentals in place. We'll put multi-factor authentication for all users, all authentication events, and we'll work with identity risks so we can identify anomalous events and suspicious activities around that identity. We can start dealing with that stolen credential problem. What has happened as multi-factor authentication has been rolled out more and more is that the attackers have moved into methods and ways of bypassing that. Nowadays, it's very commonly referred to as adversary in the middle attacks, so AITM, where the attacker is essentially able to phish the target organization. So they send some sort of phishing email, and they are able to bypass the multi-factor authentication by stealing a so-called session cookie. Let's not go into the technical details of it, but essentially allows the attacker to do just that. Now, if we look to counter that, the first thing that should come to our mind is that we need to have a robust security baseline for our email. So we got to govern and secure and monitor that attack vector. So we would have things like preventative controls and policies to recognize phishing, identify malware, to basically review all files and attachments distributed and delivered to our organization via email, which will increase our likelihood of capturing these type of AITM phishing attack attempts. Now, one of the things that the attackers often do, and we've seen this with threat actors such as, say, for example, Lapsus or Scattered Spider. There was a lot of recent high-profile compromises, for example, of Okta customers, where the threat actor basically compromised a so-called bring your own device of cloud administrators and cloud engineers. So they were able to do a lot of reckonings, early data collection, identify individuals that could potentially be high privileged engineers, and then they would effectively compromise them either through their corporate accounts or actually even through their private accounts. So how do we deal? They either compromise a BYOD device or they will compromise a managed device. And then they will look for ways to enroll non-managed devices to, for example, the target organization's device management solution. So they understand these processes and routines relatively deeply. They will know that the people who are most likely to have permission to use non-compliant devices are probably engineers, developers, etc. So they aim and target those. What we can do on the posture management side for these things is that must be very disciplined about what devices do we allow. So we will make sure that the devices that we consider managed and compliant will have certain requirements. Fundamental requirements will be things like antivirus, host-based firewall, endpoint detection response solution, and they should be running at all times. Why is that? Well, typically the threat actors, if their attack vector is a corporate device or a BYOD device, it's not necessarily a very persistent place for the attacker to be unless they establish some sort of backdoor. So think of it as a means for the attacker to keep coming back to the environment, which is very crucial for them. So in order to achieve this, what they very often try to do is that they will try to turn off security solutions. And we'll turn off things like antivirus or EDR to make sure that establishing that backdoor or preparing their next activities will become easier. Now, if we have a security baseline that says, well, we will consider the device non-compliant as soon as antivirus or EDR stops working, again, we have a baseline, so we have a posture, basic hygiene to deal with that threat. And then lastly, we will look to tie all of this together. Now we get to the actual posture. It doesn't necessarily need to be more complicated than this, but we basically say, okay, unless you are in a known identity with specific identity risk state, and unless you have a compliant and managed device, we will not give you access. You cannot enter and see our services, review our data, etc. So now we've actually established a functioning posture around our modern cloud-based end user and productivity services. Even attacks such as AITM will not really work out very well because we are requiring a managed device. So the attacker would absolutely have to do several steps to be able to gain access to our services. So that's an example from end user and productivity. Let's move into looking at platform. We need to approach these platforms a little bit differently. So you can again click at least one more time. So there we go. Good. Perfect. Animation is the enemy of the presenter. Now, if we look at this from a platform perspective, we need to approach it slightly differently. Why? Some of you might be working in software as a service company, for example. So I have to be very, very careful. How do we govern and how do we automate certain actions around our platform and infrastructure services so that we don't unnecessarily disrupt our business critical services for the sake of security? However, we do have means here. Very typical way of compromising cloud environments, platform services, is lack of proper hygiene. Typically, there is some sort of exposure, unintended exposure. Let's use the example of storage. So think of it as a place where you store your data in the cloud. There are very commonly unintended exposures of this data that lead to major breaches. In the language of Microsoft, that's where we have this example. We have essentially a storage account. Storage account is the home of all your files and the folders those files exist in the cloud, to simplify things a bit. Usually you do not want to allow public access. You want to make sure that there is no public access for this storage account. There's even security controls or security tools in the platform will look and monitor essentially if you make these mistakes. However, why do we approach it a little bit differently than end user environment is that there might be legitimate reasons sometimes for this. So if we have a storage account that has public access allowed configuration turned on, there will be a defender for cloud. So that's a Microsoft security product finding that will report to you with a big exclamation mark that you have a problem. Now, essentially, this does not yet mean that your data is exposed. It just means that somebody with appropriate permissions can change the folder and the files themselves to be publicly accessible over the internet, but they might not necessarily yet be so. We typically don't want this type of configuration in our environment, but sometimes there is a legitimate reason for it. Why do we guardrail this instead of govern it with stick? Why do we approach it in a fashion that lets identify it and then try to steer it to the right setting? So think of a scenario. This is actually from a real life incident or crisis preparedness team. This container, so this folder, might actually be hosting a file that is a static website. It is a website to prepare your organization for a potential future crisis. It's kind of a, think of it as your backup site. If you get a major crisis, you get some sort of ransomware, or your main websites and services go down, your crisis team can then set this static website up and steer your customers there to find more information. Would not be uncommon to use something like a storage account container and data services from Azure to host this type of website. Now, if we go in, we audit this, we do a finding, and we automatically remediate that, at the time of crisis, we might not realize that we have just taken down a necessary communication channel for our own company. It could be that only essentially members of crisis management team are the ones who can go into the storage account, expose the data, which is actually hosting a static website, trying to help our organization deal with crisis. There are, however, better ways of dealing with this. Now, again, if we can audit, find these things, and steer and advise our customers into, or our internal stakeholders into doing this in a better fashion, we are then following and establishing a good posture using guardrails. Principle is the same. We aim for good hygiene. We aim for good posture. We aim to avoid mistakes that threat actors exploit, which is approach it a little bit differently in end user environment and platform services. So if we start bringing these examples together in our next slide to essentially a conclusion, how do we need to think about these things? The first thing is that obviously we're seeing an increase of threat actors congregating around cloud services. So they are increasingly attacking cloud services, finding exposures, finding victims who are administrating and maintaining these services and targeting them. Yet at the same time, if we understand our responsibilities in the cloud and we spend some time exploring or finding a partner who can help us explore security options, we will very soon realize that those same cloud services have built-in security controls and security controls available for you that you can use to mitigate these threats very, very effectively. So I think a few things, just as a key takeaway from my side before passing over to Alex again, what you need to think about from your side. The first thing is that standardization often is not the enemy of security. It's the other way around. So if you're dealing with a cloud platform, it's good to look for unifying those stacks. How do we simplify? How do we reduce the number of technologies that we're using? How do we take the biggest benefit from the existing controls in our cloud platform? And how do we use them, as through our examples, to actually build a robust posture, preventing most of the known attacks? So we want to aim for some sort of unification. That is a requirement for success. Number one, it will become easier to use, less for you to maintain if you do it this way. The second thing is that, again, we need to look for things that are interoperable. The biggest enemy of security, be it security operations for use to detect and respond, or be it preventative security controls. One of the biggest enemies is silos. So we will have a multitude of different technologies that are not necessarily talking to each other. They're not glued together. So if we have something weird happening in one domain and something weird happening in another one, the dots don't connect. So it's a good requirement for success to make sure that you use your security controls in a fashion that make and reduce or kind of increase your possibility to actually detect across the board. This means they need to be interoperable. You need to get them to work together. Very often, your cloud native or built-in security controls can help you achieve this. Lastly, again, if you aim for that unification, if you get your tools to be interoperable without putting massive amount of engineering into it, the thing is that building these holistic baselines, so baselines that are defense in depth principles, so doing something in several steps for your identity, making sure that you require certain things from your devices, setting up preventative and preventative security controls and visibility into your email solutions is something that is essential. Once you have them glued together, they also become configurable. By this, we mean that you should think of a state in advance. This is the way we want our security controls to be, in advance. And then you basically put those configurations in place if you follow these principles. And if something deviates from it, then you will know that this is not as it's intended to be.
Maybe to add to this a little bit. So taking this as a summary, if you consider a use case of requirements where you need to have a healthy identity as well as a compliant device with, say, 5 or 7 security controls in it, with in case of any of those security controls will be, let's say, deactivated or will not work in the desired state, the device falls from the compliancy. And you really require those both to be simultaneously true in order to let a user to access your data. This sort of example or scenario requires obviously a bit of architectural thinking, but even more so, it does require a unified stack, because if you consider you're right now tying a identity with device compliance settings or security settings, you're tying that with access to your environment. If you have 2 or multiple different tools doing each an individual step, such as securing the identity or protecting the identity and protecting the device, basically you won't be able to achieve certain scenario from the get-go, no matter how good tooling you have, unless they fall under the same platform.
I think if I can just add to what Alex said there, one of the core things, if you think about this example he highlighted, let's say that we are in our Microsoft environment, we're using Intune device management, we got Entra ID, we're essentially under that same umbrella of our tenant, we're able to govern, but also monitor all of these events. So if, for example, our device does not fulfill some of these requirements, say, for example, the host firewall gets turned off, we can actually use our Intune portal under that Microsoft umbrella to monitor and see that there are devices that have fallen out of compliance, and here's the reason why it happened and when it happened. But not just that, if we can see somebody executing malicious code or doing suspicious activities on that device, again, we find that from the same unified stack, so we can monitor these events taking place. And lastly, we can also, under the same umbrella, have a look at all authentication, so essentially identity-related activities around that device and user accounts associated with these events.
And basically everything that Pekka just said comes out of the box. You don't have to configure any dashboards, glue them together in order to achieve this result. And I think that one of the, let's say, major benefits which people typically neglect is the fact that if you have a unified stack, typically that unified stack, yes, it has security features, but most of the time it also has features of your basic IT management, which means that, for example, device management, which means that your IT people and security people have common technology to work on. They actually understand, and it's easy for them to understand what what the other person is doing. So common ground also in terms of technology makes teamwork faster and more smoother. And if you think about the trend currently, people are going, or companies are going towards basically one, or let's say consolidated vendor strategy. And funny enough, yes, it's a global trend, not for security technologies. Across the board, things are happening the same way. People want to streamline operations, want to save on costs, but for security, from security perspective, funny enough, looking at Gartner trends and Gartner reports, it seems that the actual reason for vendor consolidation is improved risk posture. It's not even as much as, let's say, savings in your technology stack, but it's actually making sure that you don't have blind spots and that you are able to even, let's say, increase your resilience as an organization. And obviously, since security teams are often, if not almost always, understaffed, and there are not enough people on the market, basically this allows the organization to do more with the same team, because again, there is less integrations to manage. There are analytics, and just like Pekka mentioned, there's no need for doing different types of dashboards, although yes, you can, but you get a lot out of the box already. So it is easier to maintain and less to customize it. And how do we approach this situation? For us, we have developed something called Crayon Managed Security Posture, where we pretty much do all the things we were just discussing about. So we do create security baselines, which harden the environment. So we operate on Microsoft Security Stack. So it is basically features that Microsoft produces, making sure that feature set is up to date when it comes to environments. But we also establish those security controls and policies that we continuously maintain based on what new features Microsoft brings, but also in addition to that, how attack or adversary landscape changes. So if there is a new trend, new upcoming trend of certain attack, which is being spotted in the wild, like for example, attacker in the middle. I think we have noticed this attack about 1.5 years ago, or decided to actually have a dedicated protection against that, something that Pekka described earlier in the session. Today, we see all reports basically saying that, yes, this is the new trend, that while before people were, or attackers were exploiting companies without MFA, now, even if you have MFA, it's not sufficient because companies are, or adversaries are doing the exact same attack tactics. However, now they don't just steal your identity, but they basically try to get on your device and steal the session token so that they can bypass MFA. But also, in addition to environment hardening or security baseline deployments, we actually do monitoring for weak configurations and vulnerabilities. The reason being is that our aim is to be upfront. We want to make sure that the fires get put out before they become fires. So when there's a risk of fire, we would identify those and support the organization to actually remove, or let's say extinguish, that fire before it turns into, let's say, a big fire, which could include ransomware and et cetera, et cetera. But having said that, yes, there is an incident response team available as well that can respond to alerts and as well as incidents. And most importantly, security is not something that you build once. Security is a process. Cybersecurity is never complete. I mean, cybersecurity posture is never complete. You can basically tie in the screw all the time. And the more features you have available, the more flexibility you have to do that. And obviously, the more attack scenario or more the adversary landscape changes, the more you actually are required to do so. So our job is to make sure that also as part of our service, we advise our customers to be better in their resilience efforts. So on that note, we would like to thank you for your attendance. Hope that this was an informative question or session, and we would be now ready to take any questions that you may have.
Yes, thank you, Alex and Pekka. Before we jump into Q&A, I have one for you. Tell me, please, what kind of skill sets are needed to building a security posture in the cloud environment from your perspective, experience?
Yeah. I think that this is a very good question, because it really requires maybe a little bit different mindset than beforehand, because beforehand there wasn't really that much technology available to build a proper security posture. But with these capabilities now available, this really calls for teams that do have an architectural mindset, for sure, because as Pekka mentioned, you need to think about the end state where you need to be, as well as any threats that might occur. So you need to have those people that definitely can think evil, but also in addition to that, have that architectural mindset to build proper security controls as well as guardrails to make sure that the threats are covered without impeding the business operations. Also, engineering helps a lot. So having that engineering mindset basically helps you deploying just what I said. So reusable components, but also components that or baselines that minimalistically take as big coverage as possible. Pekka, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think there's a part that I'd like to add from maybe from a perspective that is often neglected, but if you think about a good security posture, I keep saying it, but it does actually come from knowing what you have. So having an absolutely very, very accurate inventory of your identities, of your devices, understanding what are the services that you actually need for your day-to-day operations, that is crucial. So if you look at it from an organization perspective, often the organizations that get attacked that have done this well are typically surviving out of these attacks much better than the ones who didn't, even if they would have had really good help from outside. You can't neglect this part. It's really, really critical to spend time on understanding your basic, most critical business processes, and then really looking at inventorizing your identities, user accounts, and devices. So just having asset management competence in the organization in your digital estate is critical. Not the only thing that will help you, but just adding into Alex's comment.
What can I say? A little bit complex, right?
It requires discipline, let's put it this way, and it requires time and effort.
Indeed, no doubt. So we have a question from the audience, and choose, you can answer both or one of you. So basically, how to select a technology strategy to ensure good security posture?
Alex, I'll give it to you.
Yeah, sure. And I think you actually answered this, right? You said streamlining is or less complexity, the more streamlined the technology stack is, which I think stands true for sure, given how many environments we need to defend. So I think that having a strategy where you basically try to minimize the amount of technology to still cover the basic needs of your security posture across different environments, I think that is something that we should be mindful of when selecting technology strategies. And I mean, just to kind of add to that, because there are obviously benefits and trade-offs. If you think about it this way, there will be always a niche product that at any given time might be for 1 or 2 years considered the best in the world. But is it is it the niche that you need? At the end of the day, if you think about, let's say, resilience and security posture, the power comes from the coverage, ease of use, interoperability, and configurability. And in that sense, this type of a, let's say, called best of the breed technology, if you will, where companies pick and choose whatever an analyst A, B, or C says, it might really backfire, because it always, the more technology you have, the more toll it takes on your team to operate those technologies effectively, make the most out of them. But even something that becomes impossible oftentimes is to integrate those together.
I think this is, to summarize that, as that very often complexity and inconsistency is the enemies of security. So you might have really outstanding technology to secure maybe 30% of your staff, or 60% or 70%, or you might be really good at securing your device, but you've kind of forgotten about your identity. And unfortunately, the modern threat actor does look for these gaps, the signs of inconsistency. And instead of going for the device where they have to bypass the outstanding EDR, I'll go for the device that doesn't have EDR at all, if that exists in the environment.
So it looks like we answered all the other questions. Well, there was a question regarding response time. Is Crayon taking over regarding the attacks for the client? And basically, Alex, you explained previously that yes, Crayon can take over and be the guardian for the client, right?
Well, yeah, in a way, we try to avoid the incidents from the get-go by identifying cases, or let's say technical mishaps that typically lead to incidents, and as well as deploying a lot of automation to take care of that very first step. So yes, that's definitely that we do. And when it comes to the incident response, yes, we do have an incident response team, because sometimes everyone gets surprised. I think it would be very naive to say that even if you do proper security posture, you will not encounter any incidents. So yes, we do have also incident response team to support in those cases.
Excellent. So I think we are able to wrap up, and massive thank you guys for joining us, sharing your experience and share it with our attendees as well. Thank you for joining us. And remember, guys, this is not goodbye. This is see you soon for our future Crayon events. Until then, stay cyber safe.